Do you remember those forgotten cooking tricks that once turned scraps into survival? In the Great Depression, these clever methods fed families when cupboards were bare. What did we lose when we stopped cooking like that? Potato peel broth was what you made when there were no bones to spare but still mouths to feed. People saved their potato peels, not the green or moldy ones, but the clean, starchy strips from good spuds, and tossed them into a pot with water, a pinch of salt, and maybe an onion if they had one. The mixture simmered until the water turned golden and fragrant, pulling out every last bit of starch and earthy flavor the peels had left. Sometimes they added celery tops or carrot ends, anything scrap-worthy. The result was a humble broth, rich in nutrients and surprisingly satisfying. It served as the base for thin soups or was sipped on its own when there was truly nothing else. It warmed the stomach and gave people a sense of having had a meal, even if it was just a bowl of flavored water. In kitchens where nothing could be wasted, even the trash held promise. Potato peel broth was never glamorous, but it was deeply practical. And for families scraping by, it was proof that a hot bowl of something could still be made from almost nothing at all. Oatmeal meat stretching was not about fooling anyone, it was about feeding everyone. When a pound of ground meat had to serve a family of 6, something had to give. The trick was to cook oats just enough so they were soft, then fold them into the meat mixture with salt, pepper, and maybe a bit of onion. The oats bulked up the meat, absorbing juices and holding everything together in meatloaf, patties, or croquettes. The taste did not change much, but the yield nearly doubled. This method made its way into thousands of Depression-era dinners, not as a gimmick, but as a lifesaver. It meant one piece of meat could stretch into 3 meals. For kids, it was just dinner. For parents, it was peace of mind. You could even season the oats first for extra flavor, or mix in an egg if you were lucky enough to have one. Leftovers were sliced cold or reheated in a pan, crisped at the edges and served again. Oatmeal made meat go further, and going further was the only way to survive. That stretch, that little bit extra, kept the table full when money and meat were running low. Breadcrumb coffee cake topping was a clever twist born from necessity and sweet tooth cravings. Butter was a luxury and store-bought streusel was a fantasy, so people turned to the one thing they had plenty of: old bread. Dried out and crumbled into coarse bits, it became the base for a topping that could rival anything from the bakery. You mix the crumbs with sugar and leftover grease, bacon fat, lard, or even schmaltz, and scattered the mix over simple batter before baking. The result was a sweet, savory crust that crisped up beautifully and added texture to every bite. It did not melt like butter would, but it crunched and it clung to the top like a golden halo. Kids loved the crispy bits, and adults appreciated that nothing went to waste. You could season it with cinnamon or nutmeg if those were on hand, but even plain, it worked. It gave plain cakes a little flair, made breakfasts feel fancy, and helped turn the most basic ingredients into something memorable. That topping was resourcefulness baked right in. Flour and water gravy base was born from empty pans and high hopes. When there were no meat drippings left to build a sauce, people had to get creative. Toasting flour in a dry pan until golden brought out a nutty flavor, and then you whisked in water, slowly, steadily, to avoid lumps. What you got was a base, simple, thick, and waiting for whatever you could stir in. Salt and pepper helped. So did leftover bacon grease or a spoonful of broth if you had any saved. Some added bouillon or dried herbs. Others kept it plain and used it to stretch out a thin meal of bread and boiled vegetables. The trick was patience, stirring until it bubbled and thickened, then pouring it over everything, biscuits, potatoes, or scraps of meat. It did not taste like roast drippings, but it warmed your belly and filled out the plate. In lean kitchens, this kind of trick was gold. It turned boiling water into something savory and familiar. And when you were scraping by, that kind of transformation meant more than most folks today will ever understand. Mock whipped cream from evaporated milk was a tiny miracle that made dessert possible when dairy was scarce. You would chill a can of evaporated milk until it was icy cold, then beat it with sugar and a splash of vanilla until it fluffed up into soft peaks. It did not hold quite like real cream, but it got close enough for cake toppings, fruit bowls, or Jell-O salads. The texture was light but sturdy, and the taste had that rich, slightly caramelized edge evaporated milk is known for. It was not perfect, but it was magic in a pinch. Housewives swore by it for special occasions or Sunday suppers when a bit of sweetness was needed. Some even froze the whipped mixture for a pseudo ice cream. The trick was making the most of shelf-stable goods and transforming what seemed flat into something joyful. No one expected miracles during the Depression, but this came close. It made humble ingredients feel celebratory. And in homes where cream was just a dream, this trick kept dessert on the table and smiles in the room. Turnip or rutabaga mashers stepped in when potatoes were gone or needed saving. You peeled and chopped the roots, boiled them until soft, and mashed them just like spuds. Bacon grease gave flavor. Vinegar added tang. Sometimes a bit of sugar balanced out the bitterness. These mashers were often served alongside boiled meats or eaten on their own with bread. They were hearty, filling, and could take on whatever flavors you had around. People raised on mashed potatoes might have complained, but over time, this dish earned its place at the table. Turnips and rutabagas were cheap, stored well through winter, and grew in poor soil, perfect for hard times. The mash was thinner than potatoes, but it had a distinct earthiness and bite. Some families swore by it, others tolerated it. Either way, it helped get dinner on the table without spending a dime. That kind of flexibility was the backbone of survival cooking. You used what you had and you learned to like it, or at least to make it work. Eggless mayonnaise might sound like a contradiction, but during the Great Depression, it was a lifesaver. Real eggs were expensive and risky to store without refrigeration, so resourceful cooks found another way. The trick involved boiling flour, sugar, vinegar, water, and a little mustard powder into a thick paste, then whisking in oil slowly as it cooled. The result was creamy, tangy, and just firm enough to mimic the real thing. It was used in potato salads, sandwiches, and anywhere a dollop of mayo was needed. While it lacked the richness of yolks, it held its own in terms of flavor and texture. It was cheap, safe to keep, and easy to make with pantry staples. Some versions added condensed milk for sweetness or lemon juice for brightness. Others were purely savory. It was not gourmet, but it made a humble lunch feel more complete. And for families trying to make the most of what little they had, eggless mayo turned barely enough into just right. Bacon grease saved in tins was a quiet pillar of Depression-era cooking. Every time bacon hit the pan, the drippings were poured into an old coffee can or mason jar, waiting to be used again. That grease-flavored beans, fried eggs, popped popcorn, and even baked into cornbread. Nothing was wasted. The fat added a smoky depth that plain oil or lard could not match. It solidified into a creamy spread when cooled and was sometimes smeared on bread in place of butter. In homes where every penny counted, that little tin by the stove was a lifeline. You measured it carefully, used it sparingly, and appreciated every spoonful. Even the smell of it heating up in the pan signaled that something good was coming. Saving bacon grease was not just a habit, it was a system of flavor preservation, one that turned scraps into satisfaction and made basic meals taste bold. Salt pork steaming for flavor was one of those tricks passed down without ever hitting paper. When beans were on the menu, which was often, a small piece of salt pork was tied in cloth or hung over the pot while everything simmered. The pork never touched the beans. It just hovered, steaming, sweating, lending its salty, smoky essence to the bubbling pot below. It was a way to stretch flavor without using up meat. The same chunk might be reused for multiple batches, trimmed and hung again until it was dry and lean. Beans took on the taste of meat without costing you the real thing. It was economical, practical, and deeply clever. In a time when every ounce of protein had to count, that little piece of pork did heavy lifting. And the resulting beans, soft, savory, and touched with richness, fed families for pennies. Water pie trick was the kind of invention you only believe once you taste it. Made from water, sugar, flour, and a bit of butter or lard if you had it, The mixture set into a sweet, custard-like filling as it baked. It was strange and magical, a pie with no fruit, no eggs, no milk, but still somehow soft and sliceable. You poured the mix into a simple crust, maybe even a cracker crust, and baked until it barely jiggled. Cinnamon or vanilla could be added for flavor, but even plain, it worked. Some called it desperation pie. Others just called it dessert. It was born out of bare cupboards and stubbornness, the need to bring something sweet to the table when nothing sweet remained, and it proved that even in the leanest moments, a little sugar and flour could still create something worth serving. Canned milk fudge was the sweet reward that came from the barest of cupboards. When chocolate was either too expensive or completely missing from store shelves, families turned to what they could still find: evaporated milk and sugar. You would pour both into a pot and boil it slowly until it thickened into a soft, caramel-colored slab of fudge. No cocoa powder, no cream, and no fancy equipment. Just two humble ingredients and a lot of stirring. If you had butter or vanilla, you added a little, but most people just let it cook down until it felt right. Once it cooled, it firmed up into something sliceable and sweet, like candy for the end of a very long day. Kids looked forward to it like it was a birthday cake, and grown-ups swore it tasted better than store-bought chocolate ever did. You could wrap it in wax paper or stack it in tins and make it last a few days if you had the discipline. Most times, it was gone by nightfall. Canned milk fudge was not just dessert. It was proof that even in the leanest moments, a little sweetness could still be found if you were willing to wait for it. Vinegar as a tenderizer was one of those tricks that quietly revolutionized Depression-era cooking. Tough cuts of meat were often all you could afford, gristly, chewy, and almost impossible to enjoy unless you knew how to treat them right. That is where vinegar came in. Just a quick soak in a vinegar-based marinade would soften the meat, break down the fibers, and help it absorb flavor. You did not need anything fancy. A splash of vinegar, a little salt, and maybe some dried herbs if you had them. Let it sit for a few hours or overnight, and suddenly that cheap cut of meat became something worth savoring. It was not about masking the toughness, it was about transforming it. Vinegar brought out the best in whatever you had, and it worked just as well on vegetables too. You would see it used in greens, stews, and even in boiled dishes to brighten up bland or starchy flavors. It became a staple because it was affordable, shelf-stable, and incredibly versatile. And the best part? It gave home cooks a sense of control when everything else felt uncertain. Bread end pudding was the dessert born from scraps. In homes where store-bought sweets were rare and tossing food was unthinkable, the stale heels of loaves, what folks now call bread ends, were saved in a tin or bread box until there were enough to work with. These dry slices got soaked in milk or water, mixed with sugar, maybe an egg if you had one, and baked until soft and golden. Sometimes there was cinnamon or raisins, but most times it was just plain and sweet, with a chewy top and soft middle. It did not look like much, but it smelled like home. You could find a version of it in nearly every community cookbook printed during the Depression. Some called it poor man's pudding, others just called it Sunday dessert. The trick was to toast or dry the bread slightly before soaking it. It helped keep the final pudding from getting too soggy. And no matter how old the bread was, once it baked up with warm milk and sugar, it felt like something brand new. It was not waste, it was wisdom. Grated apple as a sugar substitute was one of the best-kept secrets of Depression baking. When sugar was rationed or simply too expensive to justify, people turned to fruit, especially apples, to sweeten their dishes naturally. You would peel them, grate them fine, and fold the pulp into cakes, breads, or puddings to bring moisture and sweetness without using up precious pantry staples. It was not the exact same as sugar, but it worked surprisingly well. The apples added flavor, kept things tender, and helped stretch recipes that otherwise would have come up short. Sometimes you would use them on their own. Other times they got mixed with a spoonful or two of whatever sugar you had left, just to bring it over the line. Tart apples like Granny Smith worked best in baked goods, while sweeter varieties were used in cold puddings or compotes. The trick was simple, but it made a big difference. Every apple grated was a little gift back to the kitchen, a way of saying, "We are not out yet." Even now, a lot of older recipes still carry the echoes of this trick. Hardtac reinvention was the ultimate act of culinary redemption. That rock-hard biscuit, meant for long journeys and military rations, was not exactly anyone's idea of a good meal. But when food ran low and stomachs were empty, people found a way to make even hardtac useful. The trick was soaking it in warm milk or broth until it softened just enough to chew. Sometimes it was broken up and added to stews, where it melted into the mixture and thickened it like dumplings would. Other times it was sweetened and turned into a sort of pudding, with cinnamon and a splash of canned milk. It took patience and a strong jaw if you rushed it. But that dense cracker, once nearly inedible, became something you could actually look forward to. The key was in treating it like a building block, not a finished dish. People used what they had, and what they had was usually stale, dry, and overlooked. Still, they coaxed comfort from it. That is what made the trick so powerful. When you can turn something like hardtac into a warm, filling dish, it reminds you that no ingredient and no person is beyond saving. Dandelion greens boil was not a fancy recipe. It was pure necessity pulled from the dirt. When grocery shelves were bare and even vegetables became hard to find, people looked to their backyards and roadsides. Dandelions, often treated like weeds, suddenly became dinner. You had to pick them young before they flowered, or the bitterness would be too much. Then you boiled them once to soften the fibers, drained them, and boiled them again to cut down the sharp taste. After that, you could sauté them in leftover bacon fat, toss them with vinegar, or serve them over toast if you were lucky. The result was earthy, tangy, and surprisingly good once you got used to it. It filled your stomach, gave you greens when none were growing in the market, and brought something fresh into a diet that mostly came from tins. Children might have wrinkled their noses, but grown-ups knew the value. Foraging became a quiet revolution. It reminded people that the land could still provide, even when the stores could not. And when a bowl of boiled greens kept your family going for another day, that weed in the yard started to look a whole lot like grace. Rolled crust pie toppers were the sweet finish made from scraps. In a time when nothing could go to waste, not even leftover pastry, cooks got creative. The ends of pie dough were rolled thin, brushed with a little water or drippings, sprinkled with sugar or cinnamon, and baked until crisp. That was your treat. It did not take much. A warm oven, a spare minute, and a bit of imagination. These little crisps were handed out to children like cookies or set on the table with tea as a quiet dessert. Some people curled them into spirals, others cut them into strips, but the goal was the same: stretch the dough, stretch the joy. You did not need filling or fruit, just flour, fat, and whatever flavor you could scrape together. And in that act of rolling and baking scraps, there was something quietly beautiful. It turned waste into something warm. It reminded folks that even the edges mattered, and it made a house smell like home, even if there was no pie underneath. Sometimes the crust was the best part, and during the Depression it was often the only part, so people made it count, every flaky bite. Cornmeal mush slices were the breakfast that showed up twice. You would make a big pot of cornmeal mush, basically a thick porridge cooked with water and salt, and serve it hot for dinner or supper. But the real magic came the next morning. You would pour the leftovers into a pan, let them chill overnight, then slice them into thick rectangles and fry them in a little grease until crisp on the outside. What you got was something golden, crunchy, and soft in the middle, comfort food on a budget. Sometimes you would pour syrup or molasses over the top. Other times it went savory with a spoonful of beans or gravy. It was a blank slate, which made it a favorite in homes where ingredients were limited but routines were strong. You knew what you were getting. It was cheap, hearty, and filled the belly before a day of hard work. No one called it gourmet, but no one went hungry either. It taught families how to get 2 meals from one pot and how to turn yesterday's leftovers into today's ritual. That kind of thinking does not just save money. It builds resilience, one fried slice at a time. No-bake stovetop pies were the cheat code of Depression desserts. With ovens reserved for bread or simply not working at all, People found ways to make pie without ever lighting a flame under the crust. You would start with a filling, usually something like stewed fruit, canned peaches, or even rehydrated raisins, simmered with sugar and thickened with flour or cornstarch. Once it cooled, it got poured into a pie plate lined with a crust made from cracker crumbs or old toast ground fine and mixed with grease or lard. Then you would chill the whole thing until it set. No baking required. It was sweet, sliceable, and satisfying in a way that felt like cheating. You could flavor the filling with vanilla, cloves, or citrus zest if any was available, but most families kept it simple. The real beauty was in its speed and flexibility. One pan, one burner, one dessert that brought joy at the end of a long, tiring day. It proved that dessert did not need perfection. It just needed heart. And when the pie came out of the icebox, soft but solid, sweet but practical, it reminded people they still had something to look forward to. Powdered milk reconstitution with mashed potato water was the kind of trick that only a truly desperate pantry could teach you. Powdered milk was a shelf-stable lifesaver, but when the supplies started running thin, families got smart about stretching every scoop. One of the best ways was to mix it not just with water, but with the starchy water left over from boiling potatoes. That murky liquid, usually poured down the drain, suddenly had a new job, adding thickness and body to the reconstituted milk. The result was creamier and more satisfying, especially in sauces, soups, or even as a drink if you chilled it well enough. Some people even used this mixture to cook rice or oatmeal, sneaking in a little more nutrition wherever they could. It was not glamorous, but it worked. And in kitchens where every ingredient counted, it was little tricks like this that made a big difference. You were not just saving money. You were getting more from what you had, squeezing every last bit of value from the food you worked so hard to find. That kind of knowledge was passed down like gold, quietly keeping families fed when options were few. Apple core jelly was Depression-era thrift at its most brilliant. When apples were eaten, the cores and peels were not thrown out. They were the beginning of something new. You would gather them up in a pot, add water, and boil until the kitchen smelled like autumn. The peels gave color. The cores, full of natural pectin, helped everything gel without the need for store-bought additives. Then came sugar, if you had it, and the slow simmering process that turned scraps into spreadable gold. Once strained and cooled, what you had was jelly, clear, amber, and slightly tart. You could spoon it over biscuits, stir it into porridge, or tuck it between layers of cake if you were lucky enough to be baking one. People often made it in batches, storing it in reused jars sealed with wax. It was not fancy, but it was beautiful in its own way, especially when you realized it came from what most folks now toss in the trash. It proved that flavor lives in the parts we overlook. And when nothing went to waste, apple core jelly was a quiet reminder that sweetness could still be found, even in what was left behind. Onion skin dye for Easter eggs was not just a craft, it was a celebration made from scraps. Food coloring was not always available and certainly not affordable. So families turned to what they had: the flaky outer skins from yellow or red onions, saved in a jar next to the stove. Around Easter, those skins were boiled with water and vinegar, sometimes with a bit of cloth wrapped around the eggs to hold the dye in place. The result? Deep, marbled colors, coppers, russets, and warm browns no store-bought dye could match. Children watched the magic happen, waiting for their eggs to emerge like little treasures from the pot. It was slow, fragrant work, and it made the whole house smell earthy and warm. Some people added ferns or leaves under the wrapping to leave a delicate imprint. Others used wax or string to make patterns. What mattered most was the spirit behind it, creating beauty with what little you had. In homes where budgets were tight and luxuries scarce, these dyed eggs were a gift. They meant spring had come, and there was still joy to be had, even when things were hard. That kind of hope boiled into every egg. Stale cracker crusts were a Depression-era fix that turned kitchen failures into something functional and often delicious. When crackers went soft from humidity or sat too long on the shelf, they were not thrown away. Instead, folks crushed them down, mixed them with fat, usually lard or drippings, and pressed them into pie tins to form makeshift crusts. It worked for savory pies, especially meat or vegetable ones, where the cracker flavor gave a bit of saltiness and crunch. Some people toasted the crumbs first to bring out a nuttier flavor. Others just used what they had and hoped for the best. These crusts held up surprisingly well under thick fillings like potato hash, fish, or bean casseroles. They did not flake like pastry, but they gave each bite a satisfying heft. And best of all, they made use of something that would otherwise be wasted. In that way, they were more than just a substitution. They were a symbol of resilience. When the cupboards were bare and dinner depended on scraps, a stale cracker crust could hold the whole thing together. Mock ham loaf was not about fooling anyone. It was about bringing comfort when meat was a rare luxury. You would take mashed beans or lentils, stir in pork fat for richness, and add beet juice to give it that pink, ham-like color. The whole thing was shaped into a loaf, topped with a sweet glaze if you had sugar or molasses, and baked until firm around the edges. Some versions used breadcrumbs or oatmeal to bind it all together. Others included chopped onions or spices for flavor. It was salty, a little smoky, and just chewy enough to stand in for meat at the dinner table. Children would call it pink meat, even if it had no meat at all. And for families who had not seen a real ham in months, it filled a very real need. For familiarity, for warmth, and for something that felt like a meal. You sliced it thick, served it with canned vegetables or potatoes, and maybe had enough left for sandwiches the next day. It was humble food, made with care. Soup jar layering was the quiet art of making meals from yesterday's scraps. In a time when waste was not an option, families would pour leftover soup into a large glass jar, day after day, ladle after ladle. One day it might be bean soup, the next potato and onion. Over time, those layers would settle, stacking like a patchwork quilt of past meals. When the jar was full or the fridge was bare, it all got reheated together. Sometimes it made sense, sometimes it did not. But it was hot, filling, and oddly comforting. People would add a handful of noodles or a splash of milk to stretch it further. A pinch of herbs or leftover bacon grease might bring the whole thing together. You never quite knew what flavor you were getting, but it always tasted like home. It was not about elegance. It was about not going hungry. And that jar, sitting on the back shelf, reminded everyone in the house that nothing was ever wasted. Even the smallest spoonful had a purpose. Gelatin substitutes made from hooves or bones were born from pure resourcefulness. Powdered gelatin was expensive or unavailable, but families who cooked from scratch knew another way. You would save animal bones, especially ones with cartilage like knuckles or pig feet, and simmer them slowly for hours, sometimes even overnight. What came out was not just broth, it was jelly. Once cooled, the liquid set into a wobbly, clear gel that could be flavored with fruit, vinegar, or even sugar to make desserts or savory aspics. It took patience, it took heat, and it took a deep understanding of how to use every part of an animal. This homemade gelatin held together meatloaves, vegetable molds, and sometimes sweet puddings made with canned fruit. It might sound odd now, but back then it was common practice. And it was more than a thrifty habit. It was a connection to old-world cooking, passed down through generations who never wasted a single scrap. You could feel the effort in every bite. Soda biscuit revival came from the stubborn belief that no bread should go to waste, not even the dry, leftover kind. Day-old soda biscuits, too tough for the table, were split down the middle and slapped onto a hot griddle with a little bacon fat. What came off the pan looked and felt a lot like English muffins. Crisp edges, soft middles, and enough golden brown to make breakfast feel like a treat. Some families called them skillet biscuits. Others just called them what was left. You could spread jam on them, spoon gravy over them, or dunk them in coffee if you had to stretch things even further. The trick worked because soda biscuits were sturdy to begin with. They held their shape under heat and absorbed flavor like a sponge. You did not need much else, just a pan, some grease, and a little time. In a world where flour had to stretch and baking had to count, finding a second life for yesterday's bread was a quiet victory. Molasses swirl tricks were a Depression-era way to turn plain baked goods into something that looked and tasted more indulgent. When sugar was scarce and chocolate was out of reach, molasses stepped in. It was cheaper, shelf-stable, and full of flavor. Cooks would drizzle it into batters or doughs, then swirl it with a knife to make dark ribbons that baked into sticky, spiced patterns. You would find it in breads, cakes, and even biscuits, where the molasses added richness and depth without needing extra fat or eggs. The swirl was not just for looks. It concentrated the flavor, letting you taste that deep sweetness in every bite. It made a simple loaf feel special, like something from a bakery. And it made the kitchen smell like warm, spiced heaven. People used whatever they had: blackstrap for bitterness, light molasses for sweetness, or a mix of both. Even now, you can still find the old recipes in dusty cookbooks, marked up by hand, because a swirl of molasses did more than just sweeten, it lifted the whole meal. Homemade yeast starters from potatoes were the bubbling secret behind many Depression-era loaves. When store-bought yeast ran out or became too pricey, people turned to spuds. You would boil a couple of potatoes, mash them in the cooking water, and let the mixture sit until it cooled. Then came sugar and flour, stirred in to feed the natural wild yeasts floating in the air. After a few days, the mix would start to bubble. That meant it was alive and ready to leaven bread. It smelled sour, a little funky, but it worked like magic. People kept their starters alive for weeks, feeding them like pets and guarding them like treasure. This potato yeast gave breads a chewy texture and a subtle tang, and it became the backbone of baking in homes without access to store goods. Sometimes a neighbor would share a jar, helping someone else start their own batch. It was community, it was chemistry, and it was one more example of how food can connect people, even when resources are scarce. Sour milk baking was not an accident. It was a trick, learned through hardship and passed along like gospel. When fresh milk spoiled before you could finish it, you did not throw it away. You added a little vinegar to the rest and used it in your baking. The acidity worked like buttermilk, reacting with baking soda to make quick breads, pancakes, and cakes rise tall and tender. That sour milk gave everything a slight tang, like old-fashioned biscuits or cornbread. And once it was mixed in with flour, sugar, and fat, the smell disappeared. What remained was flavor, richness, and the satisfaction of knowing nothing went to waste. Some people even let the milk sour on purpose just to have it ready for baking day. It was frugal, yes, but also surprisingly effective. That tang helped cut the sweetness, made flavors more complex, and gave baked goods an old-world charm you just cannot fake. Sour milk reminded home cooks that spoilage was not always failure. Sometimes it was just the beginning of something better. Melting marshmallows for quick dessert frosting feels like something straight out of a child's birthday party, but it came from clever old-school cookbook tricks. Back when frosting ingredients like cream or butter were scarce or pricey, families found a shortcut hiding in the pantry: marshmallows. You would melt them down with a splash of milk and spread the gooey mix right over cakes or cupcakes. It cooled into a glossy, fluffy frosting that looked impressive without the time or cost of traditional icing. You would find this trick in community cookbooks and on the back of marshmallow packages from the 60s and 70s. It turned plain cakes into party showstoppers with almost no effort. Thinking back on all those rushed birthdays or last-minute bake sales, I cannot help but wish I had this shortcut sooner. One bag of marshmallows, one old cookbook, and dessert was saved. By the 50s, wine culture in America still hadn't taken its exact shape. Not like the one we know today, but a big proponent of that culture was the nationally shared experience of having a killer pot roast with some wine. Middle-class American families needed a break from the cheap bear at Josie's in Hell's Kitchen, you know? They needed to feel fancy about themselves too. Put on that Grated suit, shine those shoes, use that chapstick, and go out for some wining and dining. Pot roasts were pretty much your typical affair, and this was the kind of meal people would save up for or keep for special occasions, or just when they wanted a fun night to help pick people's moods back up at home. Some of the best wines that were served with pot roasts which were usually typically pork, beef, or chicken, were California Burgundies, which was really just an umbrella term for a dry red blend. Then you had California Zinfandel, or you could just keep it simple with some sherry. Next time you get a pot roast going, try some wine with it. It's a tried and tested classic. Geno's pizza rolls are bite-sized turnovers filled with pizza ingredients, such as cheese, tomato sauce, and toppings. The original recipe, created by Geno Palucci in the late 1960s, was known for its distinct flavor and crispy texture. Palucci was inspired to create the rolls after noticing the popularity of frozen snacks, and his Italian heritage influenced the flavors. The rolls are made by wrapping a thin dough around a savory filling, then baking or frying until golden and crispy. The original recipe included a blend of cheeses, tomato sauce, and spices, creating a rich and satisfying taste. The rolls can be customized with various fillings such as pepperoni or sausage to suit different preferences. Geno's pizza rolls offer a quick and delicious way to enjoy pizza flavors in a portable format, making them a popular snack or party food. Using ice water for fluffier pancakes might sound backward today, but your grandma probably knew better than most people give her credit for. Pancake batter. Getting too warm? That was the quickest way to end up with flat, dense flapjacks instead of the fluffy golden stacks you remember. Grandma never let that happen. She reached for ice-cold water, or sometimes cold milk straight from the icebox, and gently stirred it into the batter, keeping everything cool and airy until it hit the hot griddle. You would sit there, fork ready, watching those pancakes puff up like little clouds, fluffy on the inside, golden brown on the edges, wondering why hers always tasted better than anyone else's. It was never luck. It was quiet kitchen skill, passed down in small, careful habits you barely noticed. Grandmas understood breakfast could make or break your whole day, and nothing lifted the mood like a plate stacked high with warm, soft pancakes. No one ever talked about the ice water trick, but they remembered the pancakes, the kind that turned an ordinary morning into something worth sitting down for, bite after bite. Now, this might be an odd pairing to a lot of you, but peanut butter and bacon sandwiches really did hit. Hey, some of you who are 90s kids might even remember. This was basically one of the best lunches you could get, and to be honest, I still think a lot of people do make this even if it's not as popular as it used to be. It was just a flawless idea in concept and execution. Take 2 slices of bread, a dash of peanut butter, and some perfectly well-fried strips of bacon. It's genius. Throw in some iceberg mayo and whatever else it is you like and whatever keeps you going throughout that miserable shift, and you have yourself a full-sized snack and meal. This was basically the reason why this dish got so popular. You could even make 2 of these and still make your daily subway or bus ride if you were living in crowded urban centers. Plus, there was just so much room for variety with a dish like this that a lot of people didn't see the point in changing it up. However, that coffee work culture thing I was talking about is unfortunately a real phenomenon. Somewhere along the line, people really started to abandon the idea of having a solid meal at all for lunch, and I think you only see older workers who were raised in the 20th century still having things like this. Eggo waffles are waffles filled with syrup or fruit filling, combining the convenience of a waffle with the indulgence of a filled pastry. These quick and easy breakfast items were introduced by Kellogg's in the early 2000s, offering a unique twist on the classic Eggo waffles. The waffles are made by pressing 2 waffle halves together with a sweet filling inside. Eggo waffles come in a variety of flavors, including blueberry, strawberry, and maple syrup, providing a range of options to suit different tastes. The filled waffles are cooked until crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. Eggo waffles were often enjoyed as a quick and easy breakfast option, perfect for busy mornings or lazy weekends. Canned pineapple tenderizes meat for skillet meals might sound like a tropical gimmick now, but it was one of those vintage cookbook tricks that really earned its place. Back when meat was expensive or tough cuts were all you could afford, cooks turned to canned pineapple for help. The enzymes in the fruit broke down tough meat fibers, making them softer and more flavorful. You would toss pineapple rings or juice into a skillet with pork chops, chicken, or even beef, and dinner practically made itself. It was especially popular during the 60s and 70s, when sweet and savory meals were all the rage. You would find this tip in community cookbooks and on the labels of canned fruit. Looking back, I can only imagine how many chewy, overcooked dinners could have been saved if I had learned this sooner. Sometimes, old-school tricks and a can of pineapple really do make all the difference. Cornish game hens were a pretty forgettable moment in American history, to be honest. I mean, no wonder they are on this list after all. So, Cornish game hens were something that were a tiny bit more costly than chicken, but still relatively affordable. The minimum price for a game hen would be around 80 cents, with most places easily coming to or exceeding $1. These were also sold frozen, which was really a massive draw for people to start buying these. See, before, you had to pretty much take the entire bird home and find a way to use it unless you were okay with wasting precious meat. These individual frozen servings meant that people could pick and choose the amount of meat they actually wanted to buy. This was actually something of a fine dining moment too for places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, although it was something that went for a good price in most upscale restaurants, but still it didn't have a lot of star power. The flavors were soft and mild, and you had to really chew to get a sense for what you were having. It didn't last long beyond the 60s, and I get it. This decade is full of things to talk about, seriously. Angel food cake was honestly a lot less complicated. You didn't have to do any fancy wine-based fire bending with the pan here. You just needed egg whites, cake flour, sugar, and vanilla, and a Betty Crocker mix that you knew you could rely on. Nationwide, this was a dish that would be perfect for homemade desserts, birthdays, little ventures into making some money off of your baking, and more. They were particularly popular in diet-conscious neighborhoods, which typically existed in urban hubs because those were the only places where people had the options and accessibility to actually fine-tune their diet, as well as the budget, so think California and New York. This was a really light and airy cake that had just the most subtle amount of vanilla, and that made it enchanting for a lot of people. You couldn't beat how homey and comforting this was, and also, it just looked heavenly, which is why it got the name angel cake. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, saving overripe bananas for moist cakes was one of those quiet little traditions Grandma never needed to announce, but you could taste the results in every sweet, soft slice. You would walk into the kitchen, spot those brown spotted bananas sitting there, and probably assume they were destined for the trash. But not in Grandma's house. She saw those tired bananas as baking gold, packed with sweetness, and ready to transform plain batter into something rich and moist. The riper the banana, the softer it blended into the cake, filling every crumb with natural sugar and keeping it tender for days. Banana bread, muffins, pound cakes, they all owed their irresistible texture to fruit most folks tossed without a second thought. Grandmas understood the kitchen was not just about following recipes. It was about stretching ingredients, wasting nothing, and turning overlooked scraps into something worth gathering around. You might not have known the secret behind that banana bread growing up, but your second helping told the story loud and clear. Cold fried chicken wasn't exactly what the name makes it sound like. You can't really cold fry something, obviously, but what you can do is serve fried chicken that's been chilled, or fried chicken that's at least at room temperature. See, this was something that got popular at picnics, and it was a way for people to get rid of leftovers when they didn't have microwaves. As you might know, fried chicken tends to lose a lot of its charm when you just warm it up on a pan and stove. Now, I'm no one to judge, but that's just not how you do it. Naturally, though, if you don't have a microwave, That's where your head would go, and a lot of people just didn't back then. So, what's the next step? Do we bite the bullet and eat that delicious fried chicken cold or at room temperature? Or do we warm it up and lose a lot of the bang for buck value that comes with a 3-piece combo for like $2 or $3? Most people stuck with the first option. Cold fried chicken would also be good as a work lunch because it was an easy way to get rid of your leftovers if you didn't feel like eating it at home, plus it was super quick. Just grab the fried chicken, box it, and go. You had your work lunch for that day sorted. It caught on a lot more than you'd think, really. Sneaking vinegar into poached egg water for perfect shape was one of those old kitchen tricks Grandma never announced, but you sure noticed the results. You would sit down to breakfast, slice into that perfectly poached egg, the yolk warm and runny, the white holding its neat, delicate shape, and never suspect how it happened. Turns out, a splash of vinegar in the water made all the difference. Without it, the egg whites would scatter like silk threads across the pot, turning breakfast into a mess. But Grandma knew better. A tiny pour of vinegar firmed the whites fast, keeping the egg together, tidy and ready to impress. It was never about being fancy. It was quiet confidence built from experience, knowing small details turned a meal from ordinary to special. You never saw the vinegar bottle come out, but that egg on your plate, soft and flawless, told the story loud and clear. Stretching cake. Frosting with whipped evaporated milk was one of those genius dessert tricks that got lost along the way, but it saved countless birthday parties and bake sales in its heyday. Butter and cream were expensive, especially during tight times or rationing, but home cooks still needed a way to frost cakes and keep things looking fancy. That is where chilled evaporated milk came in. You would stick the can in the fridge overnight, pour it into a bowl, and whip it up like cream. It fluffed into a light, airy frosting that stretched farther than any butter-based recipe and cost a fraction of the price. You would find this tip in old dessert books, church cookbooks, and handwritten recipe cards tucked in family drawers. It made cakes look bakery-worthy, even when grocery budgets were stretched thin. Thinking back, I ruined enough frosting jobs trying to stretch butter alone. I wish someone had handed me this old cookbook hack sooner. Quietly boosting stews with Worcestershire sauce was one of those old kitchen secrets Grandma kept to herself, but it made all the difference. You would walk into the house, smell that stew simmering low on the stove, rich and savory, and swear there was some special seasoning hidden in there. Truth was, there was, but it came from a little glass bottle tucked in the pantry, often overlooked but never forgotten. A few drops of Worcestershire sauce were all it took to deepen the broth, adding layers of flavor that made plain stews feel like they had been simmering in a restaurant kitchen all day. It brought a hint of tang, a touch of umami, and just enough richness to stretch simple ingredients into something that felt hearty, filling, and complete. Grandmas understood meals had to be more than just food. They had to be satisfying, comforting, and worth sitting down for, even when the meat was scarce or the vegetables were humble. You might not have seen her use it, but you sure tasted it in every spoonful. That quiet little bottle carried decades of kitchen wisdom, quietly elevating simple meals without anyone the wiser. Pudding was one of the most decadent and delightful dishes you could ever have. It was something that was also prepared drastically differently than what you see available today, even in most homes. Back then, the idea really was to use a stovetop for all of your pudding-related needs. People would cook it from scratch, use milk, sugar, cornstarch, and lots of egg yolks, and then thicken it for a long time over some medium heat on the stovetop. This went for pretty much the most popular kinds of flavors like chocolate, vanilla, butterscotch, and banana, which also had local products that helped give it more of a kick. If you were having chocolate pudding, you would throw in stuff like Hershey's cocoa powder or Baker's chocolate. If you had vanilla, then you would have Watkins or McCormick or Nilla wafers for banana pudding. Most people would also serve these in glass dishes instead of big bowls, but it was a really nice experience. Now, pork roast with apples AW is one of the most classic fall dishes you could have, and I know we did go over this a while back too, but that was like saying I show speed can run. I mean, I'm not lying, but that's not really the whole truth either, is it? Pork roast with apples was a cool weather meal that was pretty much always perfect for fall and winter, and those were always seasons where you wanted to be budgeting extra tight because between all the babies made in February, holidays, celebrations, and potlucks, well, let's just say there's not a lot of room left in your paycheck for anything else. Pork roasts with apples were a cheap and convenient way for families to have an incredible meal. All you needed to do was be on point with your seasonings and sides. Most people kept it safe and simple, just throwing in mashed or scalloped potatoes or some green beans. It was a dish that would work on the table as a Thanksgiving course, or it was a dish that could last the family a couple of days. Either way, it was one of those pairings you think shouldn't work but works a little too well. Aunt Jemima frozen pancakes are frozen pancakes that offer a quick and convenient breakfast option, often paired with syrup or fruit. Introduced by Aunt Jemima in the 1970s, these fluffy pancakes were a staple for busy mornings or lazy weekends. Known for their pancake mixes, Aunt Jemima expanded their line to include frozen pancakes to cater to families on the go. The pancakes are made from a classic pancake batter and then frozen to preserve their freshness. They could be heated in the microwave or toaster and were often served with toppings like butter, syrup, or fruit. Aunt Jemima frozen pancakes were particularly popular for their light and fluffy texture, as well as their convenient preparation, making them a beloved breakfast choice that offered a comforting and delicious way to start the day. Making buttermilk with vinegar and regular milk was one of the earliest cooking tricks I wish I had known sooner. Buttermilk gives pancakes, biscuits, and dressings that signature tang and soft texture, but it is the one ingredient I always seemed to be missing when I needed it. Old cookbooks had the answer. Pour a tablespoon of vinegar into a cup of milk, stir, and let it sit for a few minutes. That was it. You just made your own buttermilk ready for baking or cooking without running to the store. It worked perfectly for fluffy biscuits, tender pancakes, or even creamy ranch dressing. You saved time, money, and a whole lot of frustration trying to track down a carton of the real thing. This was the kind of practical, budget-friendly kitchen trick that folks leaned on for decades. Looking back, all those flat pancakes and dry biscuits could have been avoided if someone had just passed this old cookbook trick down sooner. Baked ziti couldn't land further on the opposite side of the spectrum. So far, this is our most expensive item yet. The cheese for this bad boy would run you around 50 to 70 cents easily, and that was a price you could expect in most markets and grocery stores. The canned tomato sauce was the cheapest, since it would basically just be for $12 or $14, and the pasta itself was around $15. Naturally, in places with a heavy concentration of Italian-American populations across the suburbs and neighborhoods, this dish was a regular hit. Northeast, you had Connecticut and New York making new strides with how well Americans understood pasta. In the Midwest, traditional forms of authentic Italian dishes and recipes were being preserved by immigrants that had a knack for tradition. This rich and cheesy dish might taste just a bit different depending on where you find yourself landing, but it's something worth trying in whatever area of the United States you find yourself in. The pasta and tomato sauce were cheap, and since it was cheesy, it didn't have a lot going on. People saw it as a dish that was okay for your casual lunch or dinner, especially on a budget. On the other hand, stuffed bell peppers were an American classic, especially in places like the South. The idea was really similar to the egg-stuffed salad tomatoes I was talking about. Even then, I told you how it's more or less like these bell peppers. The idea here this time was to hollow these peppers out and fill them in with things like rice, tomato sauce, and ground meat. They were also the perfect thing to take to work because you could carry them in just about anything. The more transportable something was, the better it would function as a work lunch. Stuffed bell peppers also had the extra effect of giving you a boost of energy, which was always really nice because desk jobs, as I'm sure all of you might be familiar with, can suck the soul out of you. The reason these were popular in the South is because it's arguably the home of stuffed peppers and all variants of them. Those people love their spice, man. Kid Cuisine is a line of frozen meals for children, often featuring cartoon characters on the packaging. Introduced in 1989 by Conagra Foods, these meals provided a balanced, kid-friendly dinner with fun sides like corn or mac and cheese. The meals typically include an entree, a side, a dessert, and sometimes a small toy or game on the packaging, engaging children beyond just the meal. Kid cuisine offers a variety of options, such as chicken nuggets, mini corn dogs, and pizza, appealing to children's tastes. Kid cuisine meals are microwavable and easy to prepare, making them a convenient option for busy families. The inclusion of a dessert, such as a brownie or pudding, adds to the appeal of these meals. The variety of options also meant that there was something for every child's taste. Preventing fruit pies from boiling over with a knotted rag sounds like something out of a fairy tale, but your grandma probably did it more than once, and you never gave it a second thought. You would see that pie cooling on the counter, golden brown, bubbling fruit inside, and not a drop of sticky mess oozing down the sides, and wonder how she pulled it off every time. The trick? A simple cloth, damp or dry, tied neatly around the rim of the pie dish. It caught the bubbling juices as they tried to spill over, saving the oven from burnt sugar disasters and keeping the crust neat as a picture. Grandmas never learned these tricks from cooking shows or recipe books. They picked them up at church socials, neighborhood potlucks, or from their own mothers, watching with quiet curiosity. That little knotted rag was one of many unspoken habits tucked into every perfect pie crust and sweet, bubbling filling. The family never asked how the pie stayed so neat. They just ate, smiled, and thanked Grandma for making dessert look and taste like something straight out of a storybook every time. Using evaporated milk to make creamy sauces was one of those pantry hacks from vintage cookbooks that stretched groceries and made dinner feel fancier than it was. Back when refrigeration was spotty and cream was expensive or hard to find, families turned to canned evaporated milk. It kept on the shelf for months, and when mixed into sauces, soups, or casseroles, it brought all the creamy richness you wanted, without spoiling or blowing the grocery budget. You would see this trick in church cookbooks, community recipe swaps, and clipped from old magazines. It made macaroni and cheese silkier, turned tomato soup velvety, and added depth to gravies and pot pies. Looking back, I cannot count how many bland sauces could have been saved if someone had passed this one down to me sooner. It is the kind of old-school wisdom that makes you appreciate how resourceful cooks really were. On the other hand, Bananas Foster was a dessert that was very, very cheap. Man, I can't even tell you how many kids would die for this. It would be a non-stop pity party of how nothing good ever happened to them, and how they really, really want a Banana Foster. They'd do the dishes, they'd promise to do all the chores, get their homework done by 7, eat some broccoli, not go out, get in bed by 9, and just be the spitting image of a model child, all for a serving of Foster. Why was it so good? Well, you tell me what happens when you put butter, brown sugar, vanilla ice cream, and more cinnamon than is probably safe for a kid or anyone really in one place. Now, of course, Bananas Foster does involve rum, and when serving it to children, that was an aspect of the dish people chose to exclude. But when the dinner table was above 18, oh boy, both bananas and bottles of rum would finish, and that was something you could come to expect like clockwork. This was actually something that was made in Brennan's restaurant in New Orleans around 1951, but it didn't get as popular as it is in this description until later on into the 60s, especially in highly metropolitan areas. Funny Feet ice cream is an ice cream treat shaped like a foot, typically strawberry flavored with a bubblegum toe. This quirky dessert was introduced in the 1980s by Walls, capturing the imagination of children with its unusual shape and playful presentation. Walls strategically positioned this product during a time when novelty ice creams were becoming increasingly popular, aiming to capture a significant share of the market with its innovative design. The ice cream is made from creamy, strawberry-flavored ice cream, molded into the shape of a foot, and topped with a small piece of bubble gum as the big toe. Funny Feet. Ice cream was often enjoyed as a summertime snack or a special treat, providing a playful and refreshing way to cool down. Turning leftover coffee into rich cake frosting was one of those sneaky little tricks that made Grandma's cakes impossible to forget even years later. Coffee might have been a luxury at times, but nothing in Grandma's kitchen went to waste, especially not that cold, leftover pot sitting forgotten on the stove. Instead of tossing it, Grandma poured it straight into the frosting, especially chocolate frosting, and just like that, the whole cake came to life. It added depth, richness, and that grown-up flavor you could never quite put your finger on. The coffee was subtle, you never tasted it outright, but it brought a warmth and boldness that made those cakes feel extra special. You would eat a slice, maybe two, thinking she used some expensive secret ingredient from a store shelf. But no, it was just that old pot of coffee and quiet, clever know-how passed down through years of making do. Grandma never announced her tricks, never needed applause, but every bite carried that hidden secret tucked neatly between the layers, wrapped up in frosting and family tradition. Cakes like that were more than dessert. They were quiet reminders of how far a little creativity could stretch. Share your favorite forgotten trick in the comments, like the video, and subscribe if you believe old scraps still have stories to tell.